Well, I have to say the Africa Climate Summit is the high point in its uniqueness because we haven't had one before. And I, like many others, have been very inspired by President Ruto's reframing of the issues and challenge to the world, actually, to see Africa in a completely different way. Without in any way diminishing the huge moral responsibility that the rich world has to meet its commitments. And we are in a situation of huge immorality with the debt crisis spiraling out of control. The crisis that many countries face are largely exogenous shocks. It's not macroeconomic mismanagement. It's COVID, it's the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis, it's climate, the increase in interest rates following quantitative easing. All of those things have contributed to this debt crisis. And so we all have a moral responsibility to address it. So I think it's really important to put that front and center, but I think it's also really important to put the opportunities front and center. I just want to underscore a point that Laurence made. I just want to emphasize it. The connection between public ownership and de-risking in finance may not be obvious to anyone, but let me give you a very clear example. In the early days of the development of renewable energy, when subsidies were required in Europe, because in Spain and Germany and many other places, that's what brought the cost down initially before China took over in terms of renewables. Every time there was a policy change, the cost of capital goes up. And those policy changes are due to shifts in politics, around polarization, about retreats from policy, about hesitation. And so there is a direct correlation between public ownership, political ownership across multiple parties and sections of the community, multi-level engagement, and access to markets and the level of confidence that investors have. And so public ownership is not just an absolute necessity from a political standpoint, it's an absolute necessity from a financial standpoint. And I just wanted to underscore that. And I think having a whole of society, whole of Africa conversation here will fundamentally change the way that people view investment opportunities in Africa, because they will see a coming together of governments, of private sector, civil society, institutional investors, indigenous peoples, all saying, we want to be on this green train and we need to come together, and here are the conditions for our participation. And I want to just go into the conditions for participation just very briefly, because I know there are a lot of speakers. I think we need action at every level, and this is the complexity. So it is clear that with the Bridgetown agenda and the Accra-Marrakesh agenda of the V20, very clear asks have been put on the table of the multilateral system, which is no longer fit for purpose. It was designed 80 years ago when many of the countries present here weren't independent. It needs a fundamental change. It needs a change in governance. It needs a change in the way the instruments work, in everything. A key goal, a key metric is going to be bringing down the cost of capital, particularly for Africa. It is unacceptable that Africa is paying many multiples for green investment than other parts of the world that have similar macroeconomic levels of stability and have much higher levels, actually, of debt on their balance sheets than Africa. And we are now seeing a massive wealth transfer from Africa to Wall Street because a lot of the debt is in the private sector and the interest rates got jacked up by the central banks of the global north. So we have to confront those issues and we have to reform the multilateral system. None of that is going to be quick. But in order for the system to stop working only for the creditors, it has to have a shift in the way that Africa and other parts of the developing world enter the conversation. And this is what I find so exciting about the Africa Climate Summit. There is a real potential here to start rethinking the international financial system, rethinking financial markets, rethinking how debt markets work, that give agency to the countries that need the investments, that have the huge assets. We heard it from President Ruto today. Youth, natural capital, huge potential for value addition around the export of critical minerals, moving from a commodity exporter to an industrial hub. Huge opportunities, but that requires us to rethink, and that requires a different kind of engagement. But I agree with Laurence and many others that that's going to require a huge amount of ambition, agency, and coordination by Africa, including huge investments in science and technology to move up the value addition chain to get that 7 trillion share of the green growth markets that were highlighted this morning. So huge investment. A lot of that is going to have to be motivated domestically, locally. But I think if that happens, it will change the global conversation in a very fundamental way. And that is why so many people have shown up, and we've had registration and accreditation has been overwhelmed, because I'm not sure people realize quite how much international interest there would be. And so it shows just how powerful it is when Africa comes together and says something different and challenging and disruptive. And there are many, many, many allies around the world that want to be part of that growth story. So that's why I think Africa Climate Summit is the most exciting.